When Helen Mirren speaks, people listen. Every word feels deliberate, shaped by decades on stage and screen. Yet for years there was one topic she rarely touched: her time working alongside Christopher Plummer. Together they portrayed one of the most complicated marriages in history in The Last Station, the story of Leo Tolstoy and his wife Sofia. Critics called it a masterclass in acting, but behind the scenes something far deeper was unfolding. Two giants, two perfectionists, two artists who demanded truth from every line they spoke. Their performances burned with real emotion because, as Helen would later admit, it wasn't all acting. There were moments of tension, admiration, and quiet understanding, the kind that only happens when two people truly see one another. Now, after years of silence, Helen Mirren has decided to speak, not about the gossip or the awards, but about the man behind the legend. The Christopher Plummer she knew, brilliant, complicated, and achingly human. When filming began on The Last Station in the late 2000s, Helen Mirren and Christopher Plummer were already cinematic royalty. She had just come off an Oscar win for The Queen, and he was entering the final extraordinary phase of a career that had spanned more than 50 years. Yet neither seemed interested in reliving old triumphs. What drew them to this project wasn't prestige, but truth, the kind that comes from exploring love at its most fragile. Plummer was cast as Leo Tolstoy, the aging writer wrestling with fame, guilt, and the limits of his own convictions. Mirren would play Sofia, the wife who refused to be erased from history. On paper, it was a story about the Russian author's final days, but to both actors, it became something more intimate, a portrait of endurance, resentment, and devotion that mirrored every long relationship weathered by time. The first table read, set the tone. Plummer arrived early, script in hand, already transformed into Tolstoy's quiet intensity. Mirren, observant and meticulous, watched him work before stepping into Sofia's wounded fire. When their voices finally collided across the table, the room fell silent. What emerged wasn't performance, it was confrontation. Two masters testing each other's boundaries. Crew members would later recall how easily the lines between acting and reality blurred. One moment, they were rehearsing a fight over Tolstoy's manuscripts. The next, they were debating the very meaning of love. Between takes, Plummer would wander off to adjust his costume or sip tea in solitude, while Mirren stayed behind, studying every detail of the scene. Both had built careers on precision, yet here they were, surrendering to something unpredictable. Director Michael Hoffman knew what he had the instant the cameras rolled. Their energy was electric, not loud, but charged with lived experience. There was no need for false dramatics. Their eyes told the story. Hoffman later said that filming them felt less like directing and more like bearing witness. Every argument between Tolstoy and Sofia carried the weight of two real people confronting mortality and memory. Off camera, Mirren often spoke of Plummer with a mixture of awe and curiosity. He could be gracious one moment, caustic the next, charming his co-stars then retreating behind an invisible wall. He brought a Shakespearean rhythm to every line, even when whispering. Mirren respected that control, yet sensed something fragile beneath it. She once described him as a man forever chasing perfection, knowing he'd never quite reach it. For Plummer, working with Mirren reignited something. He admired her fearlessness, the way she demanded honesty in every scene. They pushed each other to dig deeper, even when it hurt. Their arguments about character motivation often spilled into real emotion, but those clashes gave the film its soul. By the time filming ended, they had created something rare. Not just a great performance, but a mutual understanding. They didn't need to speak about it publicly. It was written in the work itself. Still, those who were there knew that something transformative had happened between them. The kind of creative intimacy that stays long after the lights fade and the applause dies. It didn't take long for the differences between Helen Mirren and Christopher Plummer to show. Both were products of the theater, but their methods couldn't have been further apart. Mirren prepared through intuition and emotional memory, allowing chaos to shape her choices. Plummer relied on structure, rhythm, and control, the precision of a man who believed that acting was music, not accident. On set, these two approaches often collided. During one early scene, Mirren improvised a small gesture, a trembling hand, reaching for Tolstoy's sleeve. Plummer stopped mid-line, breaking character. "Don't touch me yet," he muttered, eyes still burning with Tolstoy's defiance. The director called cut, the air thick with tension. Moments later, Mirren smiled faintly and said, "Then make me believe I shouldn't." It wasn't hostility, it was challenge. From that point forward, their scenes carried an edge that could never be rehearsed. The crew learned to read the rhythm of their relationship. Mornings were quiet, two professionals working separately, adjusting every movement. Afternoons brought fire. Once the cameras rolled, the restraint vanished. They argued, interrupted, and pushed one another until emotions spilled over. Hoffman didn't stop it. He knew those moments of discomfort created the film's pulse. Plummer's temper was well known. Years earlier, he had admitted to being an arrogant young bastard who mellowed only with age. Yet traces of that volatility remained. He could be biting when scenes dragged, impatient with repetition. Mirren, unafraid of confrontation, gave it straight back. Their clashes weren't personal, they were born from passion for truth. She respected his authority, but refused to be diminished by it. He respected her fearlessness, even when it exposed his own vulnerability. Between takes, tension often gave way to laughter. Plummer's charm returned easily once the camera stopped rolling. He'd make a sly joke, raise an eyebrow, and Mirren would burst out laughing. The crew could sense the mutual admiration underneath the storm. One assistant recalled seeing Plummer watch playback of a particularly raw scene, then whisper, "She's extraordinary." It was quiet praise, but it meant everything. Their dynamic reminded everyone of the relationship they were portraying, Tolstoy and Sofia, bound by love and resentment, forever circling each other. But for Mirren and Plummer, the battles were creative, not personal. Both had seen too much of life to take offense. Still, there was an undercurrent neither could ignore. Each was confronting the other's mirror image. Plummer saw in Mirren the courage he once had, the willingness to break rules, to throw herself into chaos. Mirren saw in him what awaited at the end of a long career, mastery tinged with melancholy. They were drawn together by what separated them. By the film's midpoint, the friction had evolved into rhythm. They began trusting that conflict could be useful, even necessary. When the camera rolled on their final arguments, they didn't hold back. Hoffman later said, "They fought beautifully. The emotion you see in those scenes, the exhaustion, the tears, none of it was rehearsed. It was the release of two artists who had given everything they could, not just to their characters but to each other." In the months that followed, both would call The Last Station one of the most demanding projects of their careers. For Plummer, it would bring his first and only Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor. For Mirren, it would mark one of her most layered performances. But what mattered more than the awards was what the experience revealed. That greatness is rarely polite, and honesty between artists is its own kind of love. Helen Mirren has often said that the most revealing thing about a person isn't what they say but what they protect, and on that set, she began to notice what Christopher Plummer guarded most, himself. Behind the grand voice and the elegance was a man quietly at war with time. He'd talk about Shakespeare as if quoting an old friend, yet pause before mentioning age, or legacy, or regret. Helen understood those silences. She'd lived long enough in an industry obsessed with youth to know what they meant. Plummer never made a spectacle of his doubts, but they lingered. He'd run through lines over and over, changing a single word, then shake his head. When the camera was ready, he'd deliver them perfectly, as though that small uncertainty had never existed. It was that control that fascinated Helen. To her, it wasn't ego, it was armor, the habit of a man who had survived decades in a business that often rewards confidence more than kindness. There were moments, though, when the mask slipped. Between takes, sitting by the window of their drafty Russian estate set, Plummer would hum to himself. Old jazz standards, fragments of show tunes, anything familiar enough to fill the silence. Helen never interrupted. She knew that music was his refuge, the place where he didn't need to perform. Later she'd recall that sound, his voice softened by age, but still carrying warmth, as one of her most vivid memories of him. She also saw the discipline that kept him upright. Plummer arrived on set each morning immaculate, jacket pressed, shoes polished. He'd joke about vanity, yet Helen sensed it was more than habit, it was dignity. A refusal to let the years dictate who he became. That quiet pride resonated with her. Both had fought for respect in an industry that changes its heroes without warning. Both had learned that lasting grace isn't granted. It's built, day after day. Off camera, their conversations were surprisingly ordinary. They'd talk about gardens, books, and the oddities of fame. Helen once mentioned how surreal it felt to walk down a street and be recognized for being someone else. Plummer nodded and said, "That's the curse of doing it well." It was the only time he hinted at the cost of his career, the way playing other people had made it harder to know himself. Still, Helen saw the gentleness that the public rarely did. During one long shoot, an extra slipped on the icy ground. Plummer was the first to reach her, helping her up with a joke about Tolstoy's clumsy students. No cameras, no applause, just instinct. Helen never forgot that moment. To her, it revealed the real man, generous, kind, almost fatherly. She also saw the fatigue in his eyes, as filming drew closer to the end. Not physical tiredness, but the kind that comes from carrying too much memory. The Last Station wasn't just another film for Plummer, it was in many ways a reckoning. Playing Tolstoy, a man reflecting on his life, haunted by what he left undone, forced him to face his own past, and Helen, watching him from across the set, understood the weight of that truth. By the final week, she knew she wasn't just acting beside a legend, she was witnessing a man quietly saying goodbye to his youth, his regrets, and maybe his own unfinished story. It's why, years later, when she finally spoke about him, her words carried the tone of someone who had seen behind the curtain and never forgot what she found there. By the time The Last Station wrapped, Helen Mirren and Christopher Plummer had built a rare kind of friendship, the kind that isn't declared, only earned. What began with tension had transformed into quiet respect, and eventually into trust. Neither of them was sentimental about it. They didn't trade grand speeches or flowery goodbyes, they simply understood one another, which for two veterans of the craft was enough. Their friendship was grounded in honesty. After filming ended, Plummer sent Helen a brief handwritten note. He thanked her for keeping him honest. She kept it, folded neatly between pages of her script. In interviews, she'd later say that she valued his truth more than anyone's approval. That was how they connected, through the shared understanding that truth, in life or art, often comes at a cost. They crossed paths many times in the years that followed. Award shows, charity galas, private dinners, always the same warm smile, the same gentle teasing. Plummer would bow theatrically whenever he saw her. Helen would roll her eyes and laugh. To outsiders, it looked like playful banter, but it carried something deeper, a shared memory of survival. Both had fought their way through an industry that rarely forgave mistakes. Both had lived long enough to know that admiration meant more when it came from someone who had seen your flaws up close. What struck Helen most was how deeply Plummer cared about his craft, even into his 80s. She once said that he worked like a man still trying to prove himself. It wasn't pride, it was purpose. Acting for him was oxygen. He never stopped learning, never stopped asking what could be better. That drive reminded her of why she began performing in the first place. watching him gave her renewed faith that artistry had no expiration date. Their friendship wasn't without its quiet disagreements. They often debated what truth meant on screen, whether honesty was in the words or in the silence between them. Plummer believed control gave emotion its power. Helen believed freedom did. Yet both recognized that their differences kept them sharp. When they spoke later in life, those old debates returned like an old song they both knew by heart. Off camera, they shared a tenderness that surprised even close friends. Plummer admired Helen's independence, calling her a rebel in pearls. She admired his integrity, the way he refused to settle for mediocrity. Their bond carried a strange kind of symmetry, two people from different worlds, bound by the same unspoken code. When Plummer began to slow down, Helen noticed. During the promotion for the last station, she saw fatigue creeping into his posture, a quiet acceptance that the long race was nearing its end. Still, he never complained. When asked once if he ever thought about retiring, he smiled and said, "Why would I stop breathing?" That line stayed with her. It summed him up perfectly: restless, relentless, and unwilling to fade quietly. In the years that followed, Helen spoke less about their friendship and more about what it represented. To her, Christopher Plummer wasn't just a co-star. He was a mirror, a reminder that artistry, like love, can be both painful and sustaining. Their friendship was proof that even the fiercest creative battles can forge something lasting. When she looks back on that time now, what she remembers most isn't the applause, or the awards, or even the finished film. It's the laughter between takes, the handwritten note, and the shared silence of two actors who understood that truth, real truth, only survives when it's tested by fire. When news broke in early 2021 that Christopher Plummer had passed away at 91, Helen Mirren didn't rush to make a statement. For several days, she stayed silent. Those who knew her understood why. Grief for Helen was private. She had lost not just a colleague, but someone who had changed the way she saw her own craft, and in quiet ways her life. When she finally spoke, her words were measured but full of weight. She called him a mighty heart and said working with him was one of the great privileges of her career. Yet what she didn't say spoke even louder. The pause between her sentences carried the ache of someone remembering details too personal to share. In interviews afterward, Helen described the first time she realized he was truly gone. She was rewatching a clip from the last station for a retrospective. The camera lingered on Plummer's face as Tolstoy took his final breath. Helen said it was like watching time itself disappear. The film had captured more than a performance. It had preserved something no one could replicate. His essence, his quiet defiance, the sparkle that made him impossible to forget. Behind that composure, she carried a deep admiration for how Plummer had chosen to live his later years. He never withdrew from the world. Instead, he worked until the very end, performing, recording, reading scripts, embracing life with the same curiosity that first drew him to the stage. Helen often spoke of that as his greatest lesson, that art was not about fame or recognition, but endurance. Friends close to her say that after his passing, she began keeping one of his old photographs in her dressing room. Not a posed studio shot, but a candid one. Him between takes, coat half buttoned, smirking at something unseen. She said it reminded her that even legends are just people trying to get the next moment right. When the Academy honored him in memoriam that year, Helen sat in quiet reflection. The montage rolled through his decades of work: The Sound of Music, The Insider, Beginners, The Last Station. Each clip a lifetime compressed into seconds. For many it was nostalgia. For her it was something else. A reminder that the man who once challenged her, frustrated her, and ultimately inspired her, had left behind a map of what artistic integrity looked like. She later described his death as a chapter closing, but not an ending, because even in absence, his influence persisted. Younger actors still quoted him. Directors still told stories of his dedication. And Helen, who had seen behind the mask, knew that his true gift wasn't fame. It was the reminder that vulnerability and strength can coexist in one human being. In the years since, Helen has continued to speak of him sparingly, but always with reverence. She calls him the last of the old guard, a phrase she uses carefully, because she knows it's true. In an industry that moves too fast, Plummer remained timeless, proof that elegance, wit, and moral courage never go out of style. When asked once if she ever wished she'd told him how much he meant to her, she smiled and said, "I didn't need to. He already knew." That, more than anything, reveals the depth of what they shared. Two lives intersecting briefly, leaving behind a truth neither needed to explain. Looking back, Helen Mirren often describes The Last Station as more than a film, a moment in time when two artists met at precisely the right point in their lives. For her, it was proof that connection doesn't depend on age or circumstance. It depends on honesty. And Christopher Plummer, beneath the formality and brilliance, was honest to his core. Their time together revealed that even the strongest personalities can find harmony when driven by purpose. What began as rivalry evolved into understanding. What started as artistic tension became friendship. In a career filled with unforgettable roles, it was this partnership, brief yet profound, that left Helen reflecting on what artistry truly means. When she speaks of him now, it isn't as a legend or as a co-star. It's as a kindred spirit who reminded her that truth is never comfortable, but always necessary. That vulnerability is not weakness. That mastery means continuing to search, even when the world already believes you've found it. Christopher Plummer's presence lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. It lived in the discipline he inspired, the laughter he left behind, and the courage he demanded from those who shared a stage with him. Helen carries that memory quietly, not as nostalgia, but as gratitude. Gratitude for having seen the man behind the myth. Because when the final curtain fell, what endured wasn't fame or awards. It was the echo of two voices, distinct yet in harmony, reminding the world that truth in art, as in life, only survives when it's shared. For more emotional stories, check out this video.